It was a rainy morning in New York, and the city's biting wind seemed to reflect the inner storm unfolding in Robert Harris's life. CEO of one of the world's largest technology companies, he had spent his entire life focused on his career, his status, his power. However, upon reaching the pinnacle of professional success, his personal life seemed to have become an uncontrollable roller coaster. His wife, Clara, had always been by his side, but in recent years he had emotionally distanced himself from her. On the other hand, his mistress, Alicia, appeared as an escape from his boring routine, offering him the excitement and pleasure he believed he no longer found in his marriage. It was an impulsive decision, made in the heat of the moment, when the adrenaline of novelty seemed to be the only thing that mattered. He broke up with Clara without hesitation, convinced that finding love in Alicia was the solution to everything. However, what Robert didn't know was that his actions would have a much higher price than he imagined. Clara, always the strong and independent woman, didn't take long to leave. The breakup was painful, but necessary. She already knew the relationship was slowly dying, but what devastated her most was the abandonment. As much as she loved Robert, she was forced to choose her own happiness and self-esteem. With that, she moved into a small apartment where she tried to rebuild her life, while Robert, with Alicia by his side, began to experience a life full of luxuries, travel and parties. But Robert's satisfaction soon began to fade. Alicia, who initially seemed to be the woman of his dreams, began to show a possessive and controlling side that he hadn't expected. Her caresses and promises of eternal love began to turn into demands, and the initial excitement gave way to frustration. It was then, on a rainy afternoon, that he realized Alicia wasn't the woman he thought she was. Deep down, Robert felt an emptiness. He was beginning to understand that he had lost Clara forever, and that what was most valuable in his life wasn't his professional achievements or extramarital affairs, but the silent and constant love that Clara had offered him. The pain of regret settled in strongly. Robert tried to call Clara, but the distance he himself had created seemed insurmountable. However, something inside him made him believe there was still a chance to fix things. But would it be too late? Robert Harris always saw himself as the epitome of success. Growing up in a modest Chicago suburb, he never imagined he would one day be at the helm of a tech giant. He remembered his childhood when his father, a tireless worker, taught him that hard work and dedication were the keys to success. The simple, focused life of his youth now seemed distant as he navigated the luxurious world of expensive dinners, yacht parties, and meetings with powerful investors. But Clara, his wife, was always different. She came from a family with deeper values, with roots firmly planted in the community and family ties. She didn't care about the expensive cars or the prestigious facade Robert displayed. For Clara, what mattered was the genuine connection, the love shared in the silence of their peaceful nights, far from the hustle and bustle of big cities. Over the years, Clara had begun to notice the changes in Robert. That affectionate man who took her to romantic dinners and promised that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle began to disappear. He became more distant, colder, more focused on work. Even during vacations, his mind never seemed fully present. Alicia, on the other hand, appeared in a vibrant and captivating way. She was everything Clara wasn't: impulsive, daring, and full of energy. At first, Robert felt renewed by Alicia's attention and desire, a stark contrast to the routine that dragged on alongside Clara. But soon, Alicia's imperfections began to emerge. She wasn't just passionate, she was possessive, demanding, and at times even a little manipulative. Robert, blinded by the pleasure of the moment, refused to see the signs. Clara, on the other hand, felt the loss deeply, but knew that her life could no longer continue alongside someone who no longer saw her. She moved to a small apartment in the city center, seeking not only a new home, but also a new beginning. The shock of the separation was painful, but at the same time, liberating. She found support in longtime friends, people who were willing to help her start over and rediscover her identity, far from Robert's shadow. She dedicated herself to her work as a designer, a field she had always loved but never had the chance to delve into while married. Over time, Clara began to feel she was rediscovering the woman she was before Robert, the woman who believed in her worth and her ability to be happy on her own. She felt no anger, but a quiet melancholy for what could have been, and which inevitably had fallen apart. Meanwhile, Robert found himself in a minefield of regrets. He was trapped in a vicious cycle, trying to fill the void with the extravagances Alicia provided, but nothing seemed to satisfy him. During the workday, his office became a prison of cold, soulless decisions. When he looked at his desk, where Clara's phone used to sit, he felt a sharp pain, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Alicia, for her part, was not content to be just a mistress. She wanted to be more. She wanted to be the only woman in Robert's life. Her demands became more intense, more visible, making the relationship unsustainable. Robert began to realize that the relationship he had idealized as the solution to his problems had become a prison of expectations and control. The weight of regret began to consume Robert like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. He had made an impulsive decision, his heart guided by the desire to find something new, something more exciting than the stability of his life with Clara. But now, the excitement was fading, and what remained was a deep and growing sense of emptiness. Alicia, with her possessive nature, was beginning to stifle what little freedom he desperately tried to maintain. Each day seemed harder than the last. Robert tried to focus on his work, but his mind wandered to the past, to Clara, to the life he had thrown away. He tried to convince himself that leaving Clara had been the right decision, but every time he looked at Alicia, he felt he was in a lie that only became harder to bear. Alicia wasn't making things easy. She had already started making plans for the future, as if her relationship with Robert were permanent. She constantly pressured him, making sure to be present in every aspect of his life, including business meetings. Her possessive behavior became more explicit, and she began to question Robert's every move, as if she had the right to control everything he did. One evening, after a business dinner with investors, Alicia casually commented on how Robert should spend more time with her and less with work. It was as if, at that moment, he was trapped in an invisible web from which there was no escape. His thoughts were elsewhere, but he knew that any reaction on his part could trigger an even greater crisis. Alicia didn't tolerate criticism or any kind of emotional distance. Meanwhile, Clara was beginning a new life. She was more balanced, stronger. However, something inside her still felt the pain of loss. Even knowing that Robert was a closed chapter in her life, there was still a space in her heart that she couldn't completely fill. It wasn't that she wanted to get back with him, but what she most desired was for him to understand the value of what she represented to him. But at the same time, Clara also knew she couldn't wait forever. She had chosen to move on, even if the past was something that could never be erased. Over time, Robert's internal conflicts intensified. He felt he was losing control of his own life. Alicia pressured him more and more, without realizing she was pushing him away from her, while her relentless pursuit of approval that would never come made the relationship more toxic. Robert felt exhausted, trapped, unable to make a decision that would set him free. In the quiet of the early morning, Robert had a moment of reflection. The empty apartment around him seemed to mirror the emptiness he felt inside. He looked at his desk, where he used to have his calls with Clara, and felt a wave of regret. He remembered the calm conversations and the nights when Clara was by his side, without pressure, without exaggerated expectations. Her absence now felt like a difficult abyss to cross. That's when Alicia walked through the door, interrupting his thoughts. She was visibly irritated, knowing that Robert seemed distant. Her eyes, normally bright and full of enthusiasm, now reflected an unease that Robert didn't know how to handle. "You don't pay attention to me, Robert. I need you. I demand it," she said, with a coldness that made the air around them feel thick. Robert tried to take a deep breath, attempting to remain calm. But the truth was there, stark and raw. He no longer loved her in the same way as before. What had once seemed like an exciting relationship had now become an obligation. The regret of having left Clara was eating him up inside. The conflict was no longer just between him and Alicia. It was between the man he had become and the man he wanted to be. Robert knew that somehow he needed to face the consequences of his choices. The truth was clear: he had lost himself. The question now was, would it be too late to win back what he had lost? And more importantly, would Clara be willing to take back a man who had traded her for a whim? The central conflict of the story, which revolves around Robert's regret and the loss of Clara, is not the only battle fought behind the scenes. Subplots begin to intertwine, creating a complex web that highlights the characters' transformation and their internal struggles. Clara, for example, began to get involved in a new project, a challenge that made her feel she was finally in control of her life. She had started working with an NGO that supported women who were victims of domestic violence. This new mission gave her a renewed purpose. Every time she helped a woman find her independence and self-esteem, Clara felt she was reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost in her relationship with Robert. Her passion for the cause kept her busy and connected to her own strength, pushing away the pain of the separation. Clara felt that by helping others get back on their feet, she was slowly healing herself, although deep down, the thought of Robert still lingered. On the other hand, Alicia wasn't as oblivious to Robert's dilemmas as he would like to believe. Although she seemed like just an intense and demanding lover, Alicia also had her insecurities and past traumas. She grew up in a dysfunctional family, with a controlling and absent mother. Alicia's relentless pursuit of attention and validation, which Robert initially believed to be merely a reflection of his passion, now revealed itself to be a reflection of her own emotional needs. Alicia's possessive behavior stemmed not only from her desire to be loved, it came from her need to fill an existential void, an emotional need she had never been able to satisfy. This dynamic between the three characters creates a growing tension, where each action seems to trigger a chain reaction. Clara, for example, by finding her own strength and reconnecting with her identity, begins to see Robert in a new light. She no longer sees him as the man who abandoned her, but as someone who failed to realize the value of what he had until it was too late. This changes how Clara deals with the situation. She begins to find a kind of peace, not in waiting for Robert's return, but in recognizing that she deserves someone who values her unconditionally. She no longer wants to be the woman who waits for someone who only notices her after leaving. Her strength now comes from the fact that she has rediscovered herself. Alicia, realizing that her demands were pushing Robert away, begins to wonder if she truly loves him or is merely trying to control the situation to avoid reliving the pain she suffered in the past. Her manipulative behavior, which previously seemed like a way to maintain control, begins to backfire. Alicia sees Robert's discomfort grow each day, and at some point begins to question whether the love she feels for him is genuine or just a way to fill the loneliness that has haunted her since childhood. Robert, at the center of it all, finds himself pressured from all directions. He tries to balance Alicia's expectations, his regrets about Clara, and the search for a way to escape this web of regrets and pressures. But as tensions rise, he realizes that what he fears most, losing control over his own life, has already happened. He is no longer the man who made quick, assertive decisions. The confusion he feels is reflected in his impulsive actions, in frustrated attempts to recover what he has lost. At the same time, the impact of Robert's crisis begins to be felt in the workplace. His company, once successful under his leadership, begins to show signs of instability. The personal tensions he faces are reflected in his inability to make assertive decisions and his lack of focus. His partners begin to question his leadership, and what once seemed like an unbeatable career is now on the verge of collapse. Robert begins to realize that what he has lost is not only Clara's love, but also the trust of his colleagues and possibly the respect he built over years of tireless effort. Robert could no longer ignore the signs. His life was crumbling before his eyes, and the regret was becoming an unbearable pain. The phone rang on his desk, but he didn't want to answer. He didn't want to talk to anyone, especially not Alicia, who was becoming increasingly insistent in her quest for control. When he finally picked up the phone, it was Clara. She was calm, but Robert could sense the tension in her voice. "Robert, we need to talk," she said. It was the last thing he feared hearing. He knew the time had come to face the consequences of his choices. They arranged to meet at the same restaurant where, years before, they had celebrated their successful marriage. The table was empty, except for the waiter who watched them with a curious expression. When Clara arrived, she was different. It wasn't just the way she dressed, but there was something more in her eyes, a glint of independence, something Robert hadn't seen in her in recent years. The conversation began tensely. Clara, though visibly serene, began to speak about the life she had built for herself. She no longer seemed like the woman who had suffered from abandonment. She spoke with confidence, with a gentle smile, but with a silent strength that Robert felt weighing on his shoulders. Each word she uttered seemed to pierce the shield he had built around his own regrets. "I've found myself, Robert," she said calmly. "I don't expect anything more from you. When I left, I knew it was for the best. Now I'm creating a life that's all my own." Robert's pain intensified, but he couldn't stop it. He knew Clara had overcome what he hadn't. She had freed herself from the weight of his presence. She was happy. And him? He was still trapped in the past, in the choice he had made and its consequences. It was at that moment that the true revelation occurred. Clara looked at him with sadness in her eyes, but also with understanding. "Robert," she said, "it's not about having me back. It's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about you finding yourself and discovering who you are without needing a woman to complete your life." Those words hit him right on the mark. Robert realized that all this time he had never allowed himself to be himself. He had been a reflection of the success he thought he should have. He lost himself in the roles of CEO, husband and lover, never understanding his true identity. The conversation wasn't a redemption nor an apology, but it was an awakening. Robert realized that Clara was no longer his salvation. She had saved herself. He could no longer wait for her to rescue him from his own mess. He would need to do it for himself. Alicia, for her part, wouldn't remain silent for long. When Robert arrived home that night, she was waiting, her eyes fixed on him like a beast hunting its prey. She stared at him with a mixture of anger and pain, sensing that their relationship was on the verge of irreparable collapse. "You're different," she said with a cutting coldness. "What happened to you, Robert?" He didn't answer immediately. At that moment he knew his life with Alicia had come to an end. The weight of regret and guilt was no longer something he could ignore. He could no longer live a lie, hoping that his relationship with Alicia would be the solution to the emptiness he felt. Separation was imminent. When Alicia realized that Robert was no longer willing to give in to her demands, she broke down. She began to cry, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't genuine sadness, but rather a desperate reaction to losing control. "Are you going to leave me?" she asked, and he knew that deep down the answer had already been given. He could no longer stay there, living a life that wasn't his. That night, Robert didn't have a grand epiphany, but a silent acceptance. He had lost a lot, but he had also discovered a truth he could no longer deny. the transformation he so desperately needed would come from no one but himself. Robert's decision to confront the reality of his life had an immediate and profound impact. However, the consequences were not as simple as he had imagined. The weight of the choices he had made manifested itself in unexpected and complex ways. Clara, after the encounter, didn't back down. She knew that what had happened between her and Robert was irreparable. She didn't want him back, but the encounter was a turning point for her as well. Clara understood that despite the pain and loss, she no longer had room for remorse or regrets. She had made the right choice in leaving Robert, and now found herself living a life of freedom and self-sufficiency. Her vision of the past became clearer. She no longer carried the guilt or resentment that had consumed her for so long. Robert, on the other hand, felt lost in a sea of conflicting emotions. The conversation with Clara made him realize how deeply he had failed himself, and not just her. He had lost himself in the search for external validation, and in doing so, disregarded the value of the most important human relationships in his life. The regret was devastating, but it was also a liberation. He could no longer go back in time to correct his mistakes, but he could begin to rebuild his life. But how? When Alicia realized that Robert was irrevocably changed, she reacted with a mixture of anger and sadness. She wasn't prepared to deal with the idea of being abandoned by Robert, especially after so much effort to win him over. Her reaction was a mixture of despair and manipulation. She tried to convince him that they could start over, that he still loved her, but something inside him had already changed irreversibly. Robert no longer saw Alicia as the woman who could save him from his inner emptiness. He now saw her as a reminder of what he had done wrong. This change in Robert generated a wave of consequences in his professional life. His company, which had been under his leadership for years, began to suffer the effects of his lack of focus and emotional stability. Robert still tried to maintain appearances, leading meetings and making crucial decisions, but something was broken inside him. He no longer had the trust of his colleagues, and this became clear when a major investor began pressuring him for concrete results. His inability to handle the pressure began to affect his image and his performance. Meanwhile, Clara also felt the indirect consequences of her separation. Although she was rebuilding herself emotionally, the impact of losing Robert still haunted her. She felt stronger, but in moments of solitude, she felt his absence painfully. She knew she didn't want to go back, but there was an empty space in her life that she hadn't yet been able to fully fill. Life went on, but Clara also realized that the personal transformation she was experiencing wasn't without internal challenges. She faced the silent struggle between her independence and the desire to have someone by her side. On the other hand, Alicia began to lose control. She couldn't accept the idea of being left behind, and her obsession with Robert grew irrationally. She started stalking him, sending messages, trying to meet him everywhere possible. Her relationship with Robert, which was already broken, entered an even more toxic cycle. Alicia seemed determined to destroy any vestige of peace that Robert was trying to build. She didn't want to lose him, not at all. And realizing she was losing her power over him, Alicia became even more possessive and manipulative, demanding attention at any cost. As Alicia and Robert's relationship neared its end, the repercussions of this conflict began to echo in their social and professional circles. Robert felt the growing pressure from all sides, but the greatest pressure was internal. He knew he needed to change, but the path ahead seemed tortuous and full of obstacles he didn't know how to overcome. The pain of his own deconstruction and the consequences of the decisions he had made began to become clearer. What he feared and what he now faced was the loneliness of a man who had everything but lost the essential. His despair led him to a point of deep reflection, But at the same time, he began to realize that he could only rise again if he was able to forgive himself, if he accepted that his journey to reconstruction would begin with him and only him. Robert's process of overcoming his past began slowly and painfully. He knew there were no shortcuts to the transformation he needed, but the pain of his choices drove him to seek true change. The first step was to distance himself from Alicia. He ended the relationship with her directly, without beating around the bush, and although she reacted with anger and manipulation, Robert finally understood that his peace and reconstruction would only be possible if he freed himself from everything that held him back. With the end of his relationship with Alicia, Robert had to face the pain of loneliness. There was no one left to whom he could cling to fill the inner void that consumed him. He began to work alone, focusing on himself and trying to understand why he had lost himself in the first place. He began to question his identity, his choices, and the way he had neglected the people who truly mattered. Robert's professional life also began to reflect this change. He knew his company was on the verge of a crisis. His leadership had been questioned, and his lack of focus had damaged his relationships with investors and partners. But for the first time in a long time, Robert wasn't afraid to face the consequences. He knew he needed to pick himself up, but this time it wasn't to prove anything to anyone, nor to seek validation. It was to rediscover himself and regain his own confidence. He dedicated himself to his work like never before, no longer driven by an obsession with success, but by the desire to do what was right. Robert began to delegate more, allowing others to take the reins of the company while he focused on his own recovery. He started investing in therapy, something he had never considered before. During the sessions, he found himself exposed, confronting the fears and insecurities that had led him to make such impulsive decisions. Gradually, Robert learned to cope with the pain, to perceive the origin of his internal conflicts, and to seek answers within himself, instead of depending on external factors. This internal change was also reflected in his behavior. Robert became more empathetic, more present, and more genuine in his interactions with others. He began to perceive the people around him in a new way, without judgment or pressure, simply accepting them for who they were. He reconnected with old friends, those he had neglected in his pursuit of success, and found unexpected support in the people who had always been by his side. Over time, Robert began to feel a peace he hadn't known in a long time. The pain of regret didn't completely disappear, but he learned to cope with it. He accepted that he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. From this acceptance, he began to develop a new perspective on what truly mattered in his life. Clara, for her part, was also going through a process of growth. She continued to dedicate herself to her work at the NGO, but felt there was a new phase in her life to explore. She was learning to balance her personal life with her professional mission, finding a new purpose in the support she gave to other women. Her relationship with Robert was still distant, but Clara began to realize that his transformation didn't affect her in the same way as before. She knew he had changed, but she also knew that her life didn't depend on that change. She was happy with herself, and that, more than anything else, made her feel fulfilled. Meanwhile, Alicia, who was losing control over Robert, began to focus on her own journey. Although her initial reaction to the rejection had been anger and revenge, she also began to reflect on her own mistakes and insecurities. Deep down, Alicia knew she had lost herself in her pursuit of an unhealthy love. She sought help, and although recovery was difficult, she began to take steps to understand her own motivations and eventually rebuild her self-confidence. Looking back, Robert saw that his journey of overcoming adversity wasn't just about recovering what he had lost, but about learning to live with his choices and growing from them. He knew that, even with all the losses, he had gained something more valuable than any material success: the ability to be honest with himself and with others. As the months passed, Robert's life seemed to finally be finding some stability. He had distanced himself from Alicia, rebuilt his relationship with Clara and those around him, and was rediscovering the meaning of being a leader without the need to control or seek validation. However, there was a critical point ahead, the future of his company, which still depended on difficult decisions. Robert knew he was at a crossroads. He not only had to restore the confidence of his investors, but he also needed to show that the internal transformation he had undergone was enough to redirect his professional life. He knew that, looking back on his career, he still carried the weight of past decisions. The company was at risk, and despite his personal progress, he knew he couldn't escape his responsibilities. To make matters worse, one of the main investors, Jonathan, had begun to pressure him more intensely, demanding rapid changes or a restructuring that could mean major cuts. Robert then found himself facing a moral dilemma. Should he accept the changes Jonathan suggested, which could save the company but compromise the values he now cherished? Or should he insist on his vision, risking losing what little remained? The pressure on Robert was palpable. His instincts told him to avoid the drastic changes Jonathan suggested, but his insecurity about his leadership made him question whether his personal vision was enough to lead the company to survival. He began to wonder if his internal transformation would be sufficient to cope with the pressures of the outside world, especially in the professional field. It was in this scenario that Clara, unintentionally, became part of the dilemma. She began to realize that, although Robert had changed, the weight of his journey did not leave him entirely free. She saw him struggling to maintain his integrity, but she also saw him wavering in the face of external pressure. She knew he was being forced to make decisions that could compromise the future of his company, and to some extent, compromise his own morality. In a chance encounter, Clara tried to bring Robert down to earth. "You're at a turning point, Robert," she said with a sincerity he hadn't seen in a long time. "If you give in now, it will be a setback, not only for your company, but for yourself. Remember who you've become and what you want for your future." She wasn't just trying to help him make the right decision, but she also wanted him to see that the personal growth he had achieved shouldn't be ignored. The Robert she knew, the man she loved, was transforming into someone stronger and more aware. But would this new Robert be able to withstand the external pressure that threatened to undermine everything he had accomplished? Upon hearing Clara's words, Robert felt an inner turmoil. He knew she was right, but his mind was filled with doubt. He wanted, more than anything, for his company to succeed, but he also knew he couldn't achieve that haphazardly, not without sacrificing his own personal growth. At the same time, Alicia began to realize that Robert was changing irreversibly. She, who had previously tried to manipulate and control his life, now found herself powerless in the face of his transformation. But her obsession with him hadn't disappeared. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Alicia drew closer to Robert again. She knew he was vulnerable, torn between the pressure of the company and the desire to maintain his personal integrity. Alicia began threatening him with sensitive information about Robert's past, something that could ruin his public image and destroy everything he had achieved. The threat of a scandal made Robert wonder if his journey of overcoming adversity was worthwhile. He was now not only fighting the consequences of his past choices, but also the temptation to succumb to Alicia's pressure, which somehow still had the power to affect him. However, the real battle was in his mind. The issue wasn't what Alicia or the investors wanted, but what he truly desired for his future. He needed to decide whether to submit to external expectations or continue his journey of personal transformation, no matter the cost. The decisive day had finally arrived. Robert knew that everything he had built in his life was about to be tested definitively. He sat at his desk, staring at his phone, hesitating. Alicia had made her threat once more, implying that he would lose everything if he didn't give in to her demands. His investors were waiting for a definitive answer regarding the restructuring, and the weight of the decision seemed to crush him. It was an all-or-nothing game, but deep down, Robert knew that the game wasn't about his company, nor about Alicia. He was confronting his own identity, the choices he had made, and most importantly, the man he had become. That morning was different. The clock seemed to move more slowly, and Robert felt a tension in the air. He knew he needed to make a decision, but the fear of failure still paralyzed him. There was a part of him that advised him to give in to Alicia, avoid the scandal, preserve the company's stability, maintain the status quo. But deep down, he knew that would mean betraying everything he had learned about himself. In his moment of greatest anguish, Clara called. She didn't know about Alicia's threat, nor the external pressures, but her words at that moment were like an unexpected solace for Robert's soul. "Robert," she said with surprising calm, "don't lose yourself fighting for something you no longer want. I know you can make the right choice because you've already shown who you are. You don't need to carry the weight of what was anymore. Free yourself from it." These words, simple yet powerful, cut through the fog of confusion in which Robert was immersed. Clara didn't offer him a magic solution, but she gave him the clarity he needed. She reminded him that he had already changed, that his transformation didn't need validation from anyone, not from Alicia, not from the investors. True victory wasn't about external success, but about his own integrity. At that moment, Robert realized that he had already made his choice, even without realizing it. He no longer needed anyone's approval. He needed to be true to himself, and that meant not succumbing to external pressures. He knew what he had to do. He immediately called Jonathan, the lead investor, and the other members of the company's board. During the call, Robert gave a direct and honest speech. "I understand that the situation is not ideal and that changes need to be made. But I will not compromise the values I have worked so hard for, and I hope everyone understands that. We will move forward, but with a vision that respects the ethics and principles I have always upheld." Jonathan tried to pressure him, arguing that an aggressive restructuring was the only way to save the company, but Robert stood firm. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the company would face difficulties, but he was willing to face the consequences, whatever the cost. He knew that true change wasn't on the surface, but in how he would deal with adversity from that moment on. Meanwhile, Alicia tried to manipulate the situation once again. She sent a threatening message, demanding that Robert meet with her, but he completely ignored the message. He would no longer be manipulated. Not for the first time, he realized he was no longer bound to her, nor to the pain of the past. He was in control of his own life. The climax came the moment Robert, choosing truth and integrity, felt a wave of liberation. He knew that, by making that decision, he was finally freeing himself from the chains that had kept him imprisoned in his old life of superficiality and manipulation. He didn't know what the future held for him, but at that moment, he was ready to face it, with all its uncertainties and challenges. Clara, for her part, was the first to know about Robert's decision. When he told her, she congratulated him on his courage to remain true to himself. They weren't going back to being what they were before, but for the first time, they were both at peace with their choices. Clara knew that Robert was now on a path he had forged himself, no longer depending on anyone else to define his happiness. Time passed, and Robert, although still facing challenges, began to see his life in a different way. The company, although it suffered some financial losses, began to operate more ethically, with solid values that reflected the new Robert. The internal transformation he experienced was not limited to his personal life, but extended to his way of leading, making decisions, and relating to others. Alicia finally distanced herself from his life after several failed attempts to win him back. She realized that her manipulation no longer had the desired effect. Robert remained firm in his decision not to succumb to external pressures and, in doing so, began to realize the value of true freedom. From the moment he decided to distance himself from toxic relationships and the relentless pursuit of validation, he began to rebuild his own identity. Now he was a more balanced and self-assured man, no longer a hostage to the expectations of the world around him. Clara, for her part, continued her work at the NGO, and Robert began to support her in her projects. Although they were no longer a couple, they both recognized the deep respect and friendship they had cultivated. They were, in a way, more connected than ever, not by the idea of a romance, but by the understanding that they had both grown and evolved together throughout their journeys. Over time, the company began to find its new rhythm. The changes implemented by Robert, which initially seemed like a risk, now showed signs of success. The organizational culture, now more humane and fair, attracted new investors and, more importantly, generated genuine loyalty among employees. Robert knew that true success was not only measured by profits, but by inner peace and the trust of the people around him. In the end, Robert realized that throughout his journey, he hadn't just saved his company or his image. He had saved himself. The regret, which had once seemed like an eternal shadow, had now become a distant memory, powerless over his life. He understood that true transformation wasn't about perfection or flawless success, but about learning to deal with one's own mistakes and growing from them. Robert's life was no longer defined by the choices of his past, but by the freedom to create the future he always wanted. Not as a CEO or a perfect husband, but as an upright man at peace with himself. If you connected with Robert's journey and struggle for personal transformation, be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you were in his shoes? How would you handle the pressure of difficult choices and the consequences of your mistakes? Share your reflections, like, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. Remember, we all have the capacity to change and grow, and your story can also be an example of overcoming challenges. Together, we can learn, grow, and inspire each other.